As Freeman continued his research, he began to realize that virtually all of Mead's observations in coming of age were wrong.
He used to refer to these as her Samoan fantasies, because he saw this as spreading the misrepresentation of Samoa and a false kind of anthropology to the general public.
It dawned on Freeman that if Mead's observations were wrong, then her conclusions must also be incorrect. And if that was the case, then one of the most enduring arguments for the supremacy of nurture over nature was a sham. Derek Freeman now had an epiphany. He decided to devote the rest of his career to bringing about a revolution in anthropology. A radical shift away from the power of nurture to a much more biological approach.
Derek had a very specific hero image of himself. It was St. George, and he modeled his behavior on what he perceived to be St. George doing, which is slaying the dragon, of course.
And at the end of Derek Freeman's lance was Margaret Mead. Because Freeman knew that the best way to bring about his revolution was to discredit the one book which embodied everything he now thought rotten with anthropology: Coming of Age in Samoa. Hostilities commenced when Margaret Mead visited Australia on a lecture tour.
We had a long private meeting in my study. I laid before her all of the evidence that I had that indicated that her conclusion was not empirically justified. She was very much taken aback by this and subsequently reported that she felt that her results were now under threat.
He questioned her about specific items, including the statement that she made that the Samoans had a perfect adjustment in their social life. And Margaret reacted strongly to this, saying, "I never said any such thing." And he just showed her in an underlined red passage, "Yes, you did." And she grabbed the book out of his hand and refused to let him read any further passages from her own book.
I think it's still a bit of a mystery what happened there. Knowing Derek would have harangued Margaret, and pointed out, you're wrong. And therefore she would say, "Oh my goodness, yes, I got it wrong. How nice of you to point this out to me." And I think it kind of amazed Derek that this didn't happen.
It looked as though the matter might end there. Years passed with little sign that Freeman was ready to go public with his refutation. In fact, so long did Derek Freeman remain silent that in 1978 Margaret Mead died, her reputation still intact. But if people assumed that Mead's death would signal the end of Freeman's quest, they were wrong, because Derek had been a busy man. In 1983, Derek Freeman announced the publication of a book.
Well, it was catastrophic. It was front-page news. It was going to sink cultural anthropology once and for all. It was devastating.
Coming of age had become like a religious orthodoxy, and Derek's book hit that religious orthodoxy a bit like the Da Vinci Code has hit the Catholic Church.
It came, I think, as a shock, as a bombshell. So even people who had a favorable impression of Margaret Mead were now asking the question, was her fame that well-deserved?
Freeman's book accused Mead of giving rise to what he called the most widely propagated myth of 20th century anthropology.
Derek's book was titled Margaret Mead in Samoa, The Making and Unmaking of an Anthropological Myth. A very clever, powerful title in a way, precisely because of the ambiguity of that last word, that punch line, the myth.
The one myth was the myth of Samoa being as Margaret Mead had painted it. That was a myth. The other myth was that culture could completely trump nature.
From the outset, Freeman launched into a scathing critique of Mead and her method, condemning her poor grasp of the language, the limited time she'd spent in Samoa, and her tiny pool of interviewees.
Her material on the Samoan girls was based on a few that she knew, not on any in-depth and long-term analyses of Samoan culture.
The title of the book is Coming of Age in Samoa, but she actually studied adolescent girls only on one island of Ta'u, and her sample was 26 young girls. So she didn't have the evidence to generalize to Samoa, and that's a grave deficiency.
A deficiency which, according to Freeman, had resulted in one gross error after another. Freeman claimed that growing up in Samoa was as fraught with difficulty as anywhere else, and nothing like Mead's period of perfect adjustment.
Margaret Mead presented a picture of these people as very shallow. They were just too easy about everything. They didn't have any religion because that would be too upsetting. There was no jealousy, there was no violence, there was no rape. Well, on all these points, Derek presented not just his impressions, but masses of evidence from court records and everything else that, no, the Samoans, amazingly, were just like us.
I would say that Samoa doesn't stand out in my experience from any other place. You know, that there's the usual complex mix of human behaviour. And certainly I witnessed several acts of violence while I was there. I remember one of my very best friends at the time being beaten until her arm was broken by her father because she didn't obey his rules.
As for Mead's portrayal of Samoa as a haven of free love, Derek Freeman argued that she'd underplayed something crucial. This original footage from the 1920s, about the same time Mead was in Samoa, shows a young girl being prepared for a taupo, or virgin ceremony.
The highest ideal to them of a young woman was the total virgin. And this was absolutely central, and the fate of girls who weren't virgin, who failed on this, of the ceremonial virgins, was terrible.
Far from being promiscuous, Samoans, according to Freeman, worshipped chastity above all else, something Mead had ignored. Furthermore, Freeman argued that Mead had also overlooked the influence of Christianity on Samoan sexual habits.
Derek saw that the Samoans were highly puritanical, very Christian, and Puritan Christian at that, something which Margaret had left out virtually completely.
Anybody who's been to Samoa knows that there's a deep religious conviction. Samoans have churches everywhere. There is no Samoan who's not organized into a religious community.
Even Samoans, it seemed, didn't recognize the picture Margaret Mead had painted of them.
Those things she wrote down is not right. It's not right. That's why people get mad with her, because some her idea is right, but the rest of her ideas is wrong.
But most serious of all, Derek Freeman accused Margaret Mead of possibly the greatest sin in all of science, that of manipulating one's findings to fit a pre-held theory. In this case, that nurture trumped nature.
Derek placed great emphasis on the fact that Margaret Mead came to her fieldwork with an agenda. He felt that distorted all of her collection of evidence, determined how she collected her evidence, and how she evaluated it.
And then when she wrote it up, it was written up in what was seen as just a popular novelette-ish, naive way that was geared more at selling copies than it was in answering ethnographic questions. And he felt that this was what